Welcome back, everyone. Our next speaker is Mary Miller. She is the director of the Getty Research Institute and a longtime member of the Yale University faculty, where she served as Dean of Yale College from 2008 to 2014. For both her curatorial and scholarly work on ancient Mexico, Dr. Miller has won national recognition, including the Guggenheim Fellowship and the Getty Grant. She was elected to the American Academy of the Arts and Sciences in 1994. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Dr. Mary Miller to present Who is Malinche?
Who was Malinche? Obviously, not this calendar figure that I bought sometime in the 1980s. But who was she? Is there too much? There's a lot of light on me. Is there too much light on you? Can you see the screen okay? Yes. All right. This talk will address some of the visual and textual evidence for Malinche, the figure who defines the archetype of the indigenous woman of the Americas. A woman who gives up her own culture to guide the conquering male invader, offering him insights that lead to his victory over her people. And usually the story ends in his casting her off at the end of the story. You know the other versions as well. There's Pocahontas, 3 Pocahontases, there's Sacagawea. But the story of Malinche is so hardened, so deeply steeped in its telling from the 16th century onward, that digging beneath its surface requires asking questions that neither textual nor visual evidence alone is prepared to answer. The insights of Gianna Magaloni, who presented here yesterday, have contributed to this study, as has a recent conversation with Naoko Takahatake of the GRI. Equally hardened is the idea that the invading Cortés was misapprehended as the returning fair god, a vengeful feathered serpent deity, Quetzalcoatl. Even in the late emergence of this story, and I emphasize that it is post-1550, the idea that he was offered the attire of various deities and knew which one to embody. I can't go into it here, but I agree with the late Michel Graulich, who argued in his biography of Moctezuma that what the Aztec leader was most afraid of, what he most dreaded on the eve of the Spanish invasion, was not Quetzalcoatl, but rather the emergence of Malinasochit, half-sister of the chief god, Huitzilopochtli, who you see here on the right, and that Malinasochit has many characteristics and many qualities that are like his other half-sister, Coyolxauhqui, who you see here. She was the subject of particular anxiety. And there's Coyolxauhqui again. When Moctezuma learned of a woman traveling with Cortés, he would have recognized in her the qualities of Malinasochit. Malinasochit, here's another half-sister, Malinasochit, Malintzin, Malinche, that there are competing religious explanations for the demise and transformation of the Aztecs should not surprise us. The narrative of Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a carefully constructed narrative over the course of most of the 16th century, I'll grant you, but nevertheless, he was an eyewitness, tells us that the historical Malintzin was the daughter of a Nahuatl-speaking cacique in Veracruz, sold out of the family or kidnapped, perhaps, as Camilla Townsend has suggested, after the father's death. Probably enslaved, she was brought to live in an elite Mayan household in what is today Tabasco, and where she lived among very successful elite trading people. With the Spanish invasion of the coastal plain, her Maya lord sent her and 19 other young women to the Spanish troops as a present in March of 1519. In the vigesimal counting system of Mesoamerica, lords always served up tribute in counts of 20, and the presentation of these women would have been no different. Of the Maya day names, the 20th, Ahau, is always the most important, and as the 20th, Malinche would have been held to be the most valuable, as indeed she turned out to be. In any case, these enslaved women were all quickly baptized before being handed off to be raped, and in that order. This particular young woman came to have the name of Marina, but the European R could not be pronounced in Nahuatl. In Nahuatl, she would have been known as Malina or Malinche, the Tsin equivalent to the address, the gracious and courteous address of Doña. What quickly came to Cortés's attention, however, was that Doña Marina was bilingual in both a Maya and a Nahuatl language, combined with the bilingual and previously shipwrecked Jerónimo de Aguilar. I won't explain him to you, only to say that he spoke both Mayan and Spanish. With this elaborate game of he speaks to him, to her, and onward, Cortés could kind of speak with all local elites. I note here that Bernal Diaz identified that there was another bilingual woman, a cook from Jamaica on the expedition, who spoke both Taíno and Maya. But just being bilingual did not mean that you could think strategically in your new environment. By the time Cortés needed to speak to Moctezuma, Malinche was a skilled translator and sufficiently adept in Spanish to seemingly drop the need for Aguilar. He drops out of the text as a presence in terms of translation. Because many Nahuatl names are based in day names, most scholars have considered that Marina's given name must have been from Malinali, the day sign in the central Mexican calendar. Father Motolinia may have been the first to make this assumption, but other 16th century sources identify her name repeatedly to be Malinche or Malinaltzin, even explicitly the goddess Malina Xochitl, as spelled out in the Anales de Cuautitlan of 1558. What Jeanette Peterson also points out is that Malinche, like her pre-Columbian antecedents, and we'll come to these in a minute, is a dangerous warrior. She may well have been understood in her own time to be the successor to all earth goddesses. Bernal Diaz always refers to her as Doña Marina, and he speaks of her with admiration and affection in an entire chapter of his book. He has this kind of almost, I sometimes when I read this chapter, I think he's a little love-struck, but knowing that he cannot touch her. Other authors call her Malinche or Malinche, and we don't know exactly how Marina came to be called Malinche. The first time we see that title, that term, in an indigenous hand is hand 2 of the Codex Telleriano-Romensis, notes the province that where the Spanish came upon the Indian Malinche, whom they constantly called Marina. This may be the earliest surviving indigenous reference that uses her name. But her fame was extended far and wide. Bishop Landa, far away in Yucatan, knows her name and writes it down in 1561. Furthermore, and I should just add that Cortés in his letter calls her the girl translator. Bernal Diaz also notes, interestingly enough, in pages not included in the abridged English version that most students come to first, rather than the full 5 unexpurgated volumes of Bernal Diaz. He notes that Malinche is said to come from Painala or Painal. Her mother, he says, is Cimatl, C-I-M-A-T-L. The latter is probably a corruption of Siwat, or woman, but it is also part of the names of many goddesses, particularly that of, here you see the Siwat Pipiltin, or the Siwat Kowat, woman snake, the name of one of the most revered and feared earth goddesses. However, Painal, or Painal, is an exceptionally interesting name to turn up in this context. Every scholar, including the authoritative Camilla Townsend, has assumed that it must be a place, but Painal appears on no 16th century map. She comes from Painal as a toponym, and it is unlikely that Malinche came from a place called Painal. He never says it's a place. Rather, we learn from Book 1 of the Florentine that Painal is a name for Huitzilopochtli, the chief cult god, a name especially used for his teishipla, or dough representation, constructed during festivals. Unwittingly, in this way, Bernal Diaz has given Malinche supernatural parents. In this scrambled colonial story, we can bring to the surface some of the anxiety. Malinche, or Malinasoshit, was the dangerous half-sister of Huitzilopochtli. The Mexica capital had been founded on the sacrificed heart of her son, and it was Uncle Huitzilopochtli who had slain him. Had Painal, or indeed Huitzilopochtli, sent his angry half-sister to Moctezuma to bring on the discord and dissent that would result in the end of the Aztec world and launch the sixth sun? The Aztec believed they were living in the fifth. And if Malinasoshit was on the loose, then the very foundation of the city was at risk. Hold that thought of Malinasoshit as an Aztec deity, for the historical Malinche would also have been the only individual who could have spoken the words of the new religion, Christianity, in the Nahuatl language. Jeronimo de Aguilar could have spoken it in Mayan, but she would have been the first to speak it in Nahuatl. We will never know what she said, but her capacity to speak such first words would have made those words reverberate across Mexica land, across Mexico. She may have been 2 times a goddess. When the reports of the Spanish came back to Moctezuma, he examined images made by his emissaries, his ambassadors, at the scene of the Spanish landing. Bernal Diaz, once again, is the source for a gripping textual description of the representation that Moctezuma's ambassadors made. The very fact of this image, first described in 1519 in European words, must have become a common text in Nahuatl, and indeed a common image in New Spain. For the frontispiece of Book 12 of the Florentine Codex, made 2 generations later in the 1570s, fits that Diaz description accurately. How could an image of 1572 so closely follow the word-for-word description that Bernal Diaz described having been executed in 1519? And let me underscore here that Bernal Diaz was far away in Guatemala after the success of the Spanish invasion, and he could never have seen this book itself. He was never in Tlatelolco to see Sahagun's workshop and scriptorium. When he was writing his own true history, he may well have had caches of documents, but not this one. What, of course, such an argument requires is a mechanism by which a picture could have survived for over 50 years. The original for Moctezuma would have been painted, perhaps something more like the screen fold on the right. And one would have to imagine several intermediary steps. but such an image might well have described the sudden transformation of their world. Aztec scribes would have made multiple images of this invasion. All kinds of images must have been in circulation. The strip format in Book 12, and that you see here actually from Book 11, running along one side of the text in the Florentine Codex. The strip format in Book 12 follows the strip format of earlier indigenous codices, such as the Bodarini. And it may well be that there were screen folds widely in circulation, even as the Spanish invasion and war took place, and that the Florentine Codex is both the last powerful example and a signal of and a signal to that lost documentation. How can we see this happening? Look closely at this frontispiece image and see it as if it is copied after a European print. Just bear in mind that no drawing naturally ends in so many discontinuous short lines. Normally, your pen doubles back a little bit. The difficulty of making this sort of line calls for our attention. Any conventional drawing would have gone back and forth with at least some doubled lines. These lines are characteristic of the European image made after an image. The woodcut here suggested in the grain of the sky, but also calling upon the visual authority of the European engraved reproduction. The artist is almost surely using a pen here for both line and cross-hatching, and our artist is confident, not making a single mistake for correction here or in the parallel Spanish Nahuatl text. Did you see all those mistakes in the Telleriano Romensis? No mistakes here. This is not a first draft. This is not a second draft. Maybe it's a draft, how many? We can only guess at for this new imagery. Figures expand and contract with the practiced hand of the skilled draftsman. The printing press appeared in Mexico City in 1539 for documents carefully monitored by the Viceroyalty and the Inquisition. Any use of an unauthorized technology would surely have remained deeply clandestine and repressed at best and extirpated in all likelihood. But knowledge of the printing press and recognition of the value of the reproduced image is another matter. In Europe, prints imitate drawings. In Mexico, drawings imitate prints. The hybrid image that maps space is based in models that draw on the printed image, in some cases to master the sense of depth of space, almost as if working out some kind of taught lesson. And we see this actually throughout the Florentine. The result here on this frontispiece is a visual narrative in which time, like space, unfolds. We can find sources that go back to the 15th century for these new narratives, these new visual devices, but I also draw your attention to the mid-16th century tapestries commissioned by Charles V. And these were widely reproduced in prints as well. And there were, I think none of the cartoons survive for these, but they are in, they're known as the Goleta tapestries, not to be confused with a town near Santa Barbara. And I also draw your attention to how the Book 12 frontispiece describes European water. Pre-Hispanic water scroll only returns when the indigenous have agency. Notably, the most important new deity in Book 12 is, as I think Diana alluded to yesterday, Motiuxoma, as he is becoming Christ. he becomes one of the rare color images popping with energy in his death. In the Florentine, Malinche is always in grisaille, like most European histories, and the black and white may have conferred historical authority. Bernal Diaz particularly mentions the presence in his own account of Doña Marina in the scene painted by Moctezuma's visitors to the Spanish camp. As I have already said, that in examining the picture, Moctezuma would have immediately spotted, in addition to all the strange and unfamiliar elements, including the animals that are here at the front left, one dreaded and familiar feature, a woman pointing the way. When Moctezuma saw this woman, he must have suspected that Malinasochit, vengeful mother and dangerous half-sister of Huitzilopochtli, was once again on the march. The fifth son was in peril. And in one of the other principal accounts, the Lienzo de Tlaxcala, we see what is seemingly the new sun being elevated into the sky through the agency of Malinasochit, of Marina, and of Cortés. Exposing the multiple layerings of belief and interpretation regarding Malinche during the earliest years of the Spanish invasion of Mesoamerica is no easy task. She was certainly the most important woman of the New World in the 16th century, and I would say one of the most important women anywhere of that century. Take that, Queen Elizabeth. Other complexities entered the mix, including the likely identification of Malinche with the character of the prostitute, a colonial concept that drew on the dangerous female deities of the past for their visual sources, particularly from the point of view of early colonial authorities. Any identification of the Virgin Mary with the Aztec goddesses must have been a very unwelcome phenomenon. Over the course of the 16th century, some representations of Aztec goddesses become ever more horrific, whereas representations of certain Aztec male deities improve, even in some cases taking on aspects of representation associated with acceptable Roman gods. And the Apollo Belvedere had been discovered at the end of the 15th century and was having an impact all the way to the New World. The benign representation of Tlaloc in the Codex Iztaccíhuatl would seem to bear a genealogical relationship to this Roman deity, giving him an acceptable antiquity. Quetzalcoatl may take on the character of some sort of ascetic in the Primeros Memoriales. At least one source believed him to be the incarnation of Thomas Aquinas. Any identification of the historical figure Malinche with the new deity Mary was surely incompatible with the colonial order. But remember that it would have been Malinche who spoke the first words of the new religion, maybe even tried to explain it, could she have possibly said, "Have you noticed how much no. But I think we have to recognize that this historical individual may have been understood to be a goddess in both the indigenous religion and in the new one, and surely not tenable for either patriarchy. An ascetic Quetzalcoatl, when identified with a Christian saint, made the myth of return a prophecy of male-based Christianity, one that could be successfully promulgated by religious authorities, and one that seemed to avoid the subject of troublesome female sexuality altogether. The decisive role of Malinche in the success of the Spanish invasion had little resonance until relatively recently. Bernal Diaz de Castillo certainly made the case for her in his 16th century account. And he could not have imagined the way that her name would be turned into a noun malinchismo, a term suggesting in Mexican Spanish self-hate, sexual collaboration, even treason. However, her role went far beyond her historical deeds. With the presence and power of a goddess in both the old and new orders, Malinche belongs at the center of both 16th century history and religion.
Our next presentation is a research collaboration between Jeanette, Favrot Peterson, and Kristopher Driggers. Jeanette Peterson is a research professor in the Department of History of Art and Architecture at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her teaching and research has focused on the field of pre-Columbian and colonial Latin American visual culture. She is the author of the Paradise Garden murals of Malinalco. Her long-standing interest is the intersection of European indigenous visual cultures has led to numerous articles on the Florentine Codex. Kristopher Driggers is the assistant curator, Bernard and Jeanette Schmidt curator of Latin American art at the Tucson Museum of Art. He is a PhD candidate in art history at the University of Chicago. His research focuses on the art history of Mesoamerica. Please join me in welcoming Kristopher Driggers to present this collaborative research titled The Conquest Narratives in Sahagún and Duran, Authorship, History, and Identity Politics.
Within a period of 6 years, between 1575 and 1581, the Franciscan Bernardino de Sahagún, with his Nahua collaborators, and the Dominican Diego Duran, both prepared histories of the conquest. In the Florentine Codex, Sahagún allotted 41 chapters to the earliest 1555 Nahua transcription of the conquest, drawing upon the oral testimonies of indigenous witness informants primarily from Tlatelolco. 20 years later, when Sahagún translated the Nahuatl into Spanish, the Tlacuilojque added 161 images. By contrast, Duran's Historia articulates the convictions and interpretive biases of a single author compiler, albeit one who had a complex relationship to indigeneity and the Christian legacy of the conquest. Though born in Spain, Duran grew up in Texcoco, where he learned Nahuatl. A regionally specific iconography in his paintings suggests that at least one of the painters of the Duran manuscript worked in the Texcocan tradition. In Duran, 9 paintings illuminate the history of the conquest, capping a longer history that begins with the Aztec migration and follows the growth of the empire in the long durée. In both Sahagún and Duran, image programs elaborate on, or meaningfully diverge from, their author's relationship to history and identity politics. This paper examines how manuscript images contribute to the construction of these histories, focusing on questions of authorship, materiality, and reflecting different positionalities. To do so, we explore 2 exemplary episodes that we've already heard about this morning, highlighting the unique perspectives of each manuscript and demonstrating the roles of images in constructing different visions of the conquest. The first is the bloody massacre of Mexica during the celebration of Toxcat and its aftermath. The second addresses the contested fates of the final Aztec rulers, Moctezuma and Cuauhtémoc. Both of these narratives reflect the sensitive, controversial nature of documenting regicide, as well as the impact of divergent authorial perspectives and identity politics. 16th century historiography reveals that both of these pivotal events generated significant controversy in the retellings of the conquest, litigated in written documents and in the courts. The paintings we focus on advance polemical interpretations of these events, although aspects of Duran's narrative are made more complicated still by a series of later interventions, where texts and even some images were reworked to make new arguments. The manuscripts also differ in the way the Florentines' Nahua scribes and Duran terminate their accounts. Each relies on discrete notions of history and its temporal patterns. The Florentine Codex ends with a gesture toward a more indigenous cyclical concept of history, whereas Duran's last chapters conform to a providential Christian teleology. In both Sahagún and Durán, the massacre that took place during Toshkat represents a major turning point in the history of the conquest. As Kevin Terraciano noted this morning, the Toshkat ambush was both a pretext and a causal event for Mexica resistance and war with the Spaniards. In Durán, images and text similarly establish a cause and effect relationship between the Toshkat massacre and the subsequent war. By focusing on how images relate to the texts, we see a complicated relationship emerge between the narrative and the ostensible goals of the authors. Book 12 of the Florentine Codex opens with a depiction of Toshkat that was anachronistically placed, since the actual event is described much later in the book. This choice underscores the pivotal role of the episode in precipitating the war. In this first image, a tight frame encloses a scene where Spaniards wield arms against the Nahuas in the patio before the Templo Mayor. In a circular arrangement, bodies lunge and retreat in space, a dramatic depiction of the massacre. The setting here is the Teotihuaco, or divine courtyard, and the sacred nature of this space heightens the treachery perpetrated by the Spaniards. Advancing to the section where the Toshkat massacre is reported in full, the images adopt a different scope. After illustrating the creation of a Tzoali do effigy of Huitzilopochtli for the ceremony, the Tlacuiloque describe the violence perpetrated by the Spaniards. Since music and singing always initiated and accompanied Aztec festivals, the drummers are the first to be dispatched, followed by the butchering of the hapless Mexica. 4 images visualize the graphic Nahuatl language: skulls split open, entrails spill, the ground slippery with blood. Magnified in scale and physically dominating, Spanish soldiers overpower Mexica warriors who are felled as body parts. By 1577, when the Florentine images of the Toshkat bloodbath were created, the particular history of these events had been processed not only in histories of the conquest, like those written by López de Gómara and Bernal Díaz del Castillo, but also in legal discourse. Toshkat was the subject of numerous inquests regarding Cortés's improper actions during the conquest. These records also question whether Pedro de Alvarado, the ostensible author of the massacre, was acting out of his own greed or following the orders of a superior. Responsibility for the massacre and its consequences went to the heart of whether the conquest was justly initiated. From the beginning of conquest historiography, Toshkat has thus been problematic. In its text, the Florentine Codex agrees with earlier accounts in condemning the Toshkat massacre and in inculpating Pedro de Alvarado as its instigator. The illuminations of Book 12 follow these broad strokes characterizations. Cortés is absent, and the atrocities are committed by unnamed Spanish soldiers. But in the images, too, it may be possible to see style playing an active role in constructing a sympathetic perspective with native victims of the massacre. Nearly all of the battles depicted in these frames happen without reference to architecture. Instead, the combat happens in an undifferentiated space with little reference to ground. What's more, anecdotal details are largely absent, so that the scenes economically foreground the historical violence. With their graphic immediacy, these illustrations use pre-Hispanic conventions to convey a pared-down narrative that emphasizes the essentials, clearly describing actors and their actions. In short, the text squarely attributes the massacre to Spanish greed by way of Pedro de Alvarado, and the images adopt attributes of the indigenous style, correlating style with content. In contrast, the Durán text stages its own interrogation into Cortés's role. Breaking into an editorializing commentary in an otherwise straightforward narration of history, Durán muses that Cortés could not have been present at the time of the massacre. Had he re-entered Tenochtitlan following his excursion to the Gulf Coast, he would surely have been spotted. Durán's inductive reasoning insulates Cortés from the Toshkat massacre, which was likely important to him, given his conviction that the conquest, while lamentable, served the aims of divine providence. But looking closely at the materiality of the Durán history shows that the manuscript's views on Cortés were not static. They evolved over time. For the most part, the Duran Historia, as it survives, appears to be a well-made final form, what Juan José Batalla Rosado has called a clean copy, and as Mary Miller just pointed out to us, the Florentine Codex appears similarly to be this kind of a clean copy, suggestive of a manuscript ready for presentation. There are very few corrections in the body of the Duran text, but the Toshkat chapter of the manuscript is a notable exception. Strike-throughs spill black ink across the page, eliminating passages long and short. It's still possible to read underneath some of these strike-throughs, particularly by manipulating the light in Photoshop. And we did a little bit of that. Because of this, we know that one of the ways the manuscript was consistently corrected was to change the text to de-emphasize Cortés's role in the Toshkat massacre, adding in other officers, algunos capitanes, alongside him, diminishing Cortés's personal responsibility. This is an observation first made, we should note, by Kristopher Couch. Looking at Duran's manuscript as a palimpsest, we see an argument about the conquest information, with an opinion that was reworked over time. In the Duran manuscript's singular and striking painting of the Toshkat massacre, we also appreciate how an image amplifies and complicates Duran's perspective. The Duran painters set the Toshkat massacre within a rectangular, arcaded patio space where steely gray masonry stones meld with the metallic sheen of Spanish soldiers' armor, giving the soldiers who block the exits the visual weight of architecture. This is an oppressive, claustrophobic composition, one that conveys violent immediacy. It is also an image that departs from many of the preceding images of indigenous people at war in Codex Duran, in that no one, indigenous or Spanish, is named in this painting. In sort of every preceding war painting in the Codex Duran, figures are named either with a name glyph or with a toponym. No cities of origin are annotated with place glyphs in this painting, as they were in the image that opens the following chapter, where the glyphs of towns appear appended to each warrior with a ligature. Much as we saw that Cortés's involvement in Toshkat was reduced or de-emphasized in strike-throughs, the painting in its original conception suppressed information about the specific identities of the Toshkat participants. We've already seen that the Duran painting sympathizes with the indigenous victims of the massacre, as again many 16th century accounts do, but a closer look at its iconography and composition suggests that the painting's critique of Toshkat may have been more pointed still. Strong implied diagonal lines meet at the two shiwitsoli, or turquoise diadems, worn by fallen noble victims. Although these Nahuas are unnamed, Duran concludes that the act was atrocious, at least in part because, and I'm quoting in translation here, it was the end of the flower and nobility of Tenochtitlan, where so many illustrious and courageous men died, end quote. In the Duran painting, no particular lord or town is victimized, but instead the victim of the massacre may have been nobility itself. Privileging nobility, Codex Duran's depiction of the Toshkat massacre captures that same grisly violence conveyed in the Nahuatl language text of the Florentine Codex. The Duran narrative is not nearly so prolix as the Florentine Nahuatl in its sensory details, but the images are, and it's worth pausing briefly to consider why. Duran believed in the necessity of the conquest. He attributes Spanish success in war to the divine intervention of Nuestra Señora de los Remedios, and, as Garcia Loaesa has pointed out, perhaps also to a crusader's belief in war as a means of building a universal church. Duran's personal formation, furthermore, was colored by his childhood in Texcoco, alongside a missionary identity and a propensity at once to celebrate indigenous piety and to condemn it. For the Toshkat artist, perhaps these intersecting loyalties encouraged him to illustrate the massacre with an image aligned to Nahua sympathies. Toshkat was a turning point, as it catalyzed a counter-revolt. In its immediate aftermath, Nahua forces responded with attacks on the Spanish forces that are brilliantly depicted in both codices. Color was deployed as an essential element of the painting's conception. On the left, in the Florentine, a triumphant Mexica warrior with a spear stands over a fallen Spaniard. It's worth noting that it's one of only 6 images in Book 12 that were singled out for the addition of color. In Duran's image on the right, Spanish soldiers in gray armor again meld with the monochrome of a masonry enclosure, as if they were entombed within the space where they are besieged. Juxtaposing organic vibrancy with stony rigidity, the painters choose color as the vehicle for bringing the possibility of Nahua resilience to life. As with the Toshkat massacre, disagreements in 16th century sources provide divergent accounts of the fates of the last Aztec kings, Moctezuma and Cuauhtemoc. Although the episodes of Cuauhtemoc's death fall outside of the range of the Florentine Codex, the manner in which Moctezuma was killed and the identity of his assailants was, and continues to be, hotly debated. His burial, however, clearly demonstrates the prevalence of identity politics in the conquest narrative. Moctezuma is considered weak, ineffective, even traitorous, and given a perfunctory cremation. Whereas the governor of Tlatelolco, Itzcuauhtzin, is mourned and honored with ceremonies customary for the dead of great reputation. In this comparison of the 2 cremations, note the haphazard logs thrown over Moctezuma's body on the left and the honorific crown, royal cape, and banner on Itzcuauhtzin at the right. And on that image on the right, you might also notice the tears springing from the eyes of the mourners, underscoring here the Tlatelolcan bias of this painting. Here, though, we concentrate on the equally controversial question of Cuauhtemoc's fate, as it occupies a prominent place in one of Duran's last chapters. Cuauhtemoc's death, as murky in the competing sources as Moctezuma's, occurred around 1525 during Cortés's expedition to Las Igueras in Honduras. Fearing that Cuauhtemoc and the kings of other Triple Alliance cities might lead native populations in an uprising, Cortés brought these lords as prisoners on the grueling trek. By the end of the excursion, Cuauhtemoc was dead, hung from a pochote tree, far south of Tenochtitlan. Jorge Gurria-Lacroix has written a historiographical study that shows that some sources saw Cuauhtemoc's hanging as just, provoked by the ruler for his conspiratorial behavior. Others saw the killing as another breach of justice, lamenting the hanging of a king whose lordly demeanor made his regicidal murder all the more indefensible. It is telling that at this very moment, when the text turns to describe the hanging, strike-throughs again cover the original Duran text, making the intentions of the author unclear. This markout feels conspicuous, raising questions about the motive for suppressing the text. In the painting that accompanies the chapter, we find yet another text that emerged through a process of inscription and reworking. Immediately, one is struck by the fact that this image is the work of a different artist's hand, made with a languorous line that produces elongated figures, so different from the last image we saw from Duran. But what was the subject of this painting? There is thick overpaint, hastily applied and indecorously finished. It is heaviest through the center of the painting, though it also touches areas like the hill in the upper right corner. We see that here, where one sees at least 3 figures and their weapons eliminated by the overpaint. And I'll just click back and forth for a second so you get a sense of this. And through the center line, where objects disappear below green swaths. In some areas, eliminating material seems to have been a greater priority than retaining the integrity of the image. A soldier in a bright orange costume loses his legs under a cloud of green through here. Some figures in the composition were added after overpainting, such as the armed Spanish soldiers on the right. You see them here. And the soldier on horseback who appears at the very center of the composition here. What exactly was this overpaint meant to cover up? Because much of it appears along the ground line, just below the attacking Spaniards, it seems most likely that indigenous victims are obscured from the narrative. In some areas, fields of red still peek through the later editions, perhaps blood once pooled below the bodies of fallen warriors. With these changes, there are parts of the composition that no longer make sense. One's eye might meet the soldier, just left of center, who raises an arm as if to strike a victim, but there is no one left for him to attack. The violence here is softened, so that only one indigenous warrior now falls to Spanish armies. I can see my slide here and I don't see it here. Let's try, there it is. Kristopher Couch proposed that the overpainting of the last chapter of Duran's Historia may have been motivated by a need to cover what was once a frank depiction of Cuauhtémoc's death. That the painting coincides with a textual passage where there are strike-throughs about this act of regicide supports a reading like this one. Still, it may be worth considering the fact that Cuauhtémoc died by hanging. As we've seen, the concentration of overpaint in this image is, by contrast, on the ground. Without technical study, we may only be able to hypothesize about the original image. Both this painting's evolution and its interaction with the text challenge us to see the authorship of the Duran manuscript, in at least some passages, as distributed and polyphonic. Clearly, the manuscript was adapted over time to accommodate different meanings about the justice of the conquest. We conclude by comparing the final chapters of the Florentine Codex and Duran as they locate their conquest narratives within different temporal frameworks. In the abrupt ending to Book 12, the Nawa authors hark back ruefully to a pre-contact concept of warfare and conquest, when the victorious Mexica demanded tribute, but allowed their subjects to return to their own communities. This positions the Spanish invasion and its violence within a traditional indigenous history, with its cycles of calamity and recovery, in Matthew Restall's words. That was the custom and the expectation, but they had also come to the poignant realization that the conquest would not ensure the policies of the past. Instead, like other European authors, Duran's longue durée extends beyond the fall of Tenochtitlan to a triumphalist finale in which Cortés energetically raises and rebuilds the capital city, captures and brands indigenous peoples as slaves, and initiates a program of evangelization and baptism. The Dominican explicitly claims the fruits of conquest as colonization and the realization of a universal Catholic Church. Duran's Historia conforms to a linear and teleological timeframe in which the Spanish conquest was only one event, a means to an end. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers this morning. I'm announcing that we're breaking for lunch. And I wanted to, so I don't know how many people there are, maybe 200. If you all go now to the cafeteria, there will be long lines. So I'm going to tell you there are other options. You can get food at the coffee cart. You can go into the museum plaza, and there's another coffee cart. And then there's the garden terrace. So you might want to escape the crowds and not go to the cafeteria downstairs. But I hope you all have a great lunch, and we will see you back at 2 o'clock. Bye.